It's a great day today because I see a lot of new faces. I don't quite see the faces, but I see a lot of new names. We're glad to feature a new topic today. I think those of you who have joined us for the first time, please come back. We've been running these weekly webinars on pedagogy, teaching related issues, as well as we've added trade related issues, and most recently, conversations with business executives, senior business executives. But today our topic is something that is very timely, always very timely and relevant. And we have three great people with us. We have Professor Parvez Ghauri. Welcome, Parvez, from Birmingham, UK, who I think I will say very few things about our colleagues here because you've seen their bios and they're well known to you. We have limited time, so we'd like to get on to the topic and revisit emerging markets and what is new in the world of emerging markets, especially from a scholarly point of view. And even if you're teaching in international business and emerging markets, what would be useful resources? So Parvez, of course, is also a co-author with me on the third edition, first, second, and third edition of the book on doing business in emerging markets. And this time we are also joined by the Professor Lian Liu at Georgia State University, who's a well-known scholar herself. Welcome, Lian. And Lian has of course, a different perspective on emerging markets, having studied cross-cultural frameworks, cross-cultural analysis. Typically, I moderate these conversations, but today we did something different. We brought in one of our good colleagues at Georgia State CIBER here in Atlanta, and someone who has helped us with our programs, especially with our pedagogy newsletters that you've been receiving. If you're not on the mailing list, make sure you get on those mailing lists because it's a great resource for teaching international business as well as emerging markets. So Sebastian comes to us as a communications professional, having worked most recently for Coca-Cola. And before that, I know, Sebastian, you were at the United Nations, also working on corporate communications. So welcome to you. I'm going to turn it over to you so you can direct some questions to us and we'll try to answer as best as we can. And I think you have a poll to put up initially to learn about our participants' interests.
That's right, Tamer. Thank you. And welcome to everybody from around the world. I think there's something like 90 different countries represented today. And I think we have 211 participants right now as we speak. So that's great. Thank you all for joining us. We're excited about today's discussion. We have three very distinguished panelists with us who are actually co-authors of the third edition of Doing Business in Emerging Markets. It's published by Sage Publishing and it's coming out this February 2021. So be on the lookout. The last edition was in 2012. So this new edition will be fully updated. I had the pleasure of working on it together with the team. And I can tell you it's full of facts, theories, analysis, but most importantly, it's very practical. So it should be of interest to practitioners, theories, scholars, and businessmen and alike. Excuse me. Now, before we get started, we want to hear from you because we really want to make this session as interactive as we can. So what we'd like to do, we thought of 6 broad topics we can discuss. And Hannah, if I could ask you to pull those on the screen, because what we're going to do is a poll of these 6 questions, and feel free to mark 1 or more, depending on your interest. So first, we have significance of emerging markets to the global economy. Second, we have the most interesting research topics around emerging markets. Third, we have resources for emerging markets, so teaching resource and the like. Fourth, we have the impact of COVID-19 on emerging markets. Fifth, we have the key factors facilitating the success of emerging markets, so what really makes them successful. And last, we have how emerging markets are likely to change in the decades ahead. So we will try to address all these 6 topics, But before, again, we want to hear from you what topics you're most interested in. So while you figure that out, while you complete this survey, I want to do a quick 30, 40-second go around between our three panelists to quickly ask them what makes them passionate about emerging markets and why they were attracted to this field in the first place. So Leanne, if we could start with you.
Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you, Tamir and the team. I was born in China and grew up when the country embraced the market economy on the global stage. So the transformation in culture and values and norms fascinate me. I came to the US to study intercultural communication, negotiation, conflict management. Today, I am still fascinated and continue to do research and teaching about culture and cognition and the influence on the dynamics of cross-border collaborations. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne. Pervez?
Hi, good afternoon. For me, it's afternoon here. So I have been doing research for the last 30 years on emerging markets. In fact, together with Tamer, we have this book, which is now in third edition. In the last few years, I have been doing research on the Sustainable Development Goals and how multinationals can contribute that in emerging markets towards fulfilling that. And we just 1 year ago, we completed a study on poverty alleviation. And this is just to mention that in 1990s, late 1990s, United Nations has a goal to reduce world poverty by 50%. And the deadline was set for 2015. But that deadline was met already in 2012. So this shows how fast things are going and how really a good imagination can work. So now we have almost 1 billion people out of poverty as compared to 90s. And that means lots of things are happening in emerging markets. And after all, 80% of the world population lives in emerging markets.
Thank you, Pervez. Tamer?
Yes, Sebastian, of course, we realize that emerging markets have been a fascinating topic, not just for us scholars, educators, but also business people. Business people have been focused on these dynamic transforming economies for more than 3 decades now. And these economies still provide a lot of market potential. This is where we've seen action on the part of Western firms in terms of developing export markets, developing sourcing, supply chain relationships, investment opportunities, and so on. What we see when you are in my position, having watched, having observed the evolution of the growth and transformation in these 2 dozen to 3 dozen markets, I see that they're still evolving. They're still a work in progress. I have behind me, you will notice a metaphor, I think. This is actually a bridge that connects in the city of Istanbul, the European and Asian side of the continent, of the city. The 2 continents are bridged by this new one that is actually finished. But if you look at it carefully, I have picked a picture that is still in construction, which I think tells me that emerging markets are still transforming, are still evolving, are changing. And we see different trajectories in each one. So even though we talk about some 25, 30 or so emerging markets, some have evolved and have become mature, post-emergent, sophisticated, industrialized economies with world-class companies. I'll talk more about this later. The countries like Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Israel, we used to look at it as emerging. These are really post-emerging, mature emerging markets. Others have dropped out. They're no longer changing. They're no longer progressing. And others are still trying to catch up. And it's interesting that while emerging markets started up, aspiring to catch up with their Western advanced economies, many of them have actually caught up and are now leading economies. So that's kind of interesting. We still call them emerging, but they have emerged, and I'd like to call them growing economies or post-emerging. The other thing I see that is very important is the resilience that we have seen within the emerging market bloc to disruptions. I think because of various things unique to these emerging markets, they have handled disruptions, even the pandemic, better than your advanced economies. So I think we can talk about resilience as well, which is an important concept at the individual level. We're telling these days our students to be working on their resilience and give them a long-term positive perspective. But these are also important ideas for nations, how to build a resilient supply chain, resilient economy, resilient manufacturing capacity, and so on. Finally, I guess I'll say one more thing. Emerging markets have also been interesting, not just to us in business, but other social scientists too. So economists, political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists are just as interested and have been studying emerging markets like we have. We can talk about that as well.
Great, thank you, Tamer. Now, before I bring up the results of the poll, quick question to you, follow-up question. First question we received from Trevor Williams. Trevor, thank you. Has the definition or how we define emerging markets changed? And is it still a relevant way to categorize markets?
I think the term does not apply to all of them. A better term is what we use is growth markets. If they've been able to sustain their dynamism in terms of moving ahead with industrialization, building their infrastructure, urbanization, modernization, and so on. If that is still going on, and they have not yet reached the stages that South Korea or Taiwan have reached, then they're still emerging. Some have left the scene. And there's also another category, which we call frontier economies. Those are potential candidate economies as emerging markets. Some of the Central Asian economies like Kazakhstan would be in that category. But the term is a misnomer.
Thank you, Tamer. Now, Hannah, if I could kindly ask you to put up the results of our poll. So we have, I think, the most interest, interestingly, in how emerging markets are likely to change in the decade ahead. The next topic is research topics, as you would expect from the academic community. Then third is key factors in facilitating the success of emerging markets. But good to hear there is an interest in all topics. So we'll do our best to address every one of these topics and to finish with teaching resources for emerging markets. So I want to get started with the first question for the panelists, and I'll start with you, Pervez, if I may. So if you could share a little bit what you think the significance of emerging markets to today's global economy is. And I know Tamer has talked about how the definition is changing, but broadly speaking, we'll go by the term emerging markets for the purpose of discussion today. What is the significance to the global economy?
First of all, as I mentioned earlier, more than 80% of the world population really lives in emerging markets. And for a long time, they have been rather sleeping partner in the world economy. But in the last 2-3 decades, they have really woken up. And now lots of things are happening everywhere in emerging markets. There is, I said, more than 1 billion people from poverty level to middle classes. So there is a huge middle class. There is a very young population. So majority of these emerging markets have average age or median age of 30, 35. That means there is so much potential as compared to the West. There is so much potential of growth. So, and if we start to look at the significance that who is really benefiting from this growth till today, in fact, it is mostly Western companies. I can list maybe 30, 40 Western companies who gain more than 50% of their total revenues from emerging markets. Some of them 80%, 75%. So in fact, it's the Western firms who have been benefiting so far. It is just now that even some multinationals from emerging markets are appearing, and that concept is really very, very new. Just 4 or 5 years ago, that now we see several multinationals coming from multinationals, and now we see maybe 30% of the group, Fortune 500 companies coming from emerging markets. So lots of things are happening. So I mean, it doesn't need to say that emerging markets are very significant for economy of the world and for all the other social political reasons.
Thank you, Pervez. Leanne, do you want to weigh in there as well?
Yes, continue Pervez's point about population. The large majority of world population growth occurs in the emerging market. They are the source of fresh talents and ideas in the global, not only to emerging market firms, but really global multinational firms, including in the advanced developed market. The other significance is that conflicts occur between and among emerging markets countries, like between India and China, in Armenia and Azerbaijan. They have consequences at the global level. And additionally, at the environmental natural resources front, there's a potential crisis in Southeast Asia about water. The upstream countries are diverting the water resources that can go down to the can be very impactful to the downstream countries, especially in Southeast Asia, involving mother rivers like the Ganges and Mekong, and conflict in West Africa involving the aftermath of oil industry in countries like Nigeria, and the issues with the Amazon rainforest. Those are all global level conflicts that needs to be addressed and are impactful to emerging economies and global economy, really.
Thank you, Leanne. Yeah, from a business perspective, we often think of emerging market or growth economies in terms of their potential growth, but the potential conflicts that can arise, the strain on resources, certainly have an outside effect on the world economy as well. Tamer, do you want to weigh in on this topic as well?
Yes, if you don't mind, I'll share a couple of slides here. We have prepared some resources for you to be distributed after the event today, and you'll get these slides. So we talked about already their importance in terms of the makeup of the world population, but also look at the second red row here, approximate share of world GDP. Emerging markets also account for a good percentage of the GDP, about 42%. In fact, this table I think will be useful to you in teaching as well. We make a distinction here between more mature emerging markets like South Korea and Taiwan, as well as the remainders. So this is useful. So this is definitely a significant part of the significance. They have become, and this is also apparent. This is again the percentage accounted in the orange bars here by emerging markets and world GDP. As you can see, over the last 3 decades, they make up some 42% of the world GDP, and they have caught up with the advanced economies as well. So this is still another significance. Some of these, of course, are very powerful economies like China that we need to contend with for not just economic reasons, but political reasons as well. Pervez mentioned the middle class. This is definitely the biggest mega trend, I think, in the world of emerging markets. This is what makes emerging markets so powerful, so robust in terms of market potential. The middle classes have been rising in different rates, certainly in different countries, and we've seen some deceleration perhaps or leveling off in some of them, but they're still the biggest part of the market potential, whether we're talking about their importance in terms of being leaders and opinion makers in terms of consumers, as well as contributing to the entrepreneurial drive and new business startups in emerging markets. So however you look at it, emerging markets will continue to be a very important topic for business people as well as for business scholars. And we'll talk about some new research streams in that context as well.
Great, great. Thank you, Tom. Before we get to the research strains, I'd really like to delve a little bit deeper into what factors, policy factors, macroeconomic factors, geographic factors, demographic factors really facilitate the success of emerging market growth economies to reach the status of developed countries. People often talk about South Korea as starting off as an emerging market. Now by a lot of scholars, it's grouped into as a developed market. What drives the success of these type of markets? And maybe Tom, we could start with you on this question.
Actually, very good question. And this is something we addressed, and I'm going to pull up the slides again with your permission, because I think we have a framework that is very useful here. When three of us sat down and talked about how we would want to organize our book in this new version, we asked ourselves, there are different factors in, like you were discussing, Sebastian, in the transformation of these dynamic economies, but they come into the picture at different levels. So we talked about, first of all, the first block here, the legacy assets. These are the foundation building blocks that all emerging markets started with. And then we compare these to the enablers, things that were put in place by the decision makers, typically in close collaboration between the business community and the state. States were very active in the transformation. If you look at some of the mature emerging markets, there is a very deliberate participation and a cohesive working environment between the national government as well as the business community. And the outcomes, if you look at the legacy assets, the building blocks, we see cultural cohesion, something that Leanne can talk a lot about, why these markets, these economies are also interesting in terms of culturally and their territorial integrity. People talk about, Sebastian, institutional gaps in the world of emerging markets. We talk about idiosyncratic institutions. We don't talk about gaps. We don't talk about the absence of modern institutions like we see in the advanced economies. There are parallel institutions like trust-based, relational-based institutions, which make business go on and business processes go on. So we talk about these idiosyncratic institutions as one of the building blocks. Relationalism. We talk about family conglomerates that were already there, and they contributed quite a bit to the transformation of emerging markets. The inadequate nature of the infrastructure enabled these proactive governments to focus on a targeted basis in certain types of infrastructure, building communications and transportation, and other types of necessity building blocks for these countries to transform. So there's a lot of these things that were already there. Some were enablers in terms of market liberalization, structural reforms, rapid industrialization, modernization, and privatization that we've seen in Eastern Europe to a large extent, and even in China and Russia now to some extent. strategic investments in selected industries. And the outcomes are pretty straightforward. So as a result, the more successful ones have come out with a strong economy, an increasing percentage of the world GDP, a rising middle class, amazing entrepreneurial spirit, which is also fueled by the rising middle class. I think there's a two-way relationship there. As the middle class builds up, entrepreneurial class also responds to the opportunity. And the rise of what we call homegrown multinationals, emerging market multinationals. Today, they are competitors with their Western counterparts in many industries, from steel to cosmetics, from cosmetics to confectionery. So
Great.
this,
Thank you,
I
Tommy.
think this is a useful concept here.
Yeah, if I could ask you to leave that slide up for a second, and by the way, to everybody on the call today, in the third edition of the textbook, there's an in-depth analysis of each single one of these factors and how much they contribute. But Leon, maybe in your point of view, does any of these factors on this list stand out as especially important?
I would just say one thing is about the relationship that Tamir mentioned. This especially business-government relationship, given the informal institutions in emerging market. And this is, I guess I'm spilling over to the research topics because relationship, the Western research about relationship at organizational level, country level, the concept is social capital. That's pretty transactional. But emerging markets, based in culture, there are lots of ideas. It's a more salient idea about dealing with relationships. For example, Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, famously said about how to deal with government. He said, be in love with them, but don't marry them. That's a very fascinating paradox for firms to deal with in terms of relationship. And then there are ideas, not only the Chinese study guanxi, there's the Brazilian term of jeiqing, wasti in the Middle East, jugaad in India, polenta in Mexico. These are more salient ideas and the factors that will contribute to the success and effectiveness of emerging market, managing an emerging market.
Great, thank you, Leon. So it sounds like you're saying that the effective use of the legacy assets also has tremendous impact on the eventual outcome of the growth economy. Pervez, if you could go, same question. Any factors that really stand out in your mind?
Yeah, I think I can mention a couple of factors that cross over all these aspects, because now more and more emerging markets have realized the importance of leadership. Now we really see a very young breed of leadership in many emerging markets. Those are educated people, they know what it takes, and they are a little bit embarrassed sometimes that why their countries are so far behind than West or other more advanced countries. So that means there is a real drive among leaders to pick up their countries and make them at the same level and be part of the economic ecosystem. And so leadership has become very, very important, and that's crossover all over. And then the other thing, which in fact the digitalization has done, that things have become so transparent that now those things about corruption and we don't know how to deal with government and this and that, they are really disappearing. So the digitalization and many, as you know, we all know that many emerging markets are much more advanced in digitalization than many Western countries. So that means they have leapfrogged. They have sort of leapfrogged. They are in the upper level of digitalization. That means that there are lots of transparent. Everything is transparent. You don't have to apply for something, a passport or ID card or driving license, and stand in queues and this and that. You just fill in the forms and attach the necessary documents, and they come. And so that means this has helped a lot to bring up these countries. And the third is, of course, corruption is going down. Everybody knows. United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are have been contributing towards that. So all these things are very, very important. So we mentioned several times middle classes. So the normal view of Western multinational was that emerging markets or developing countries, they don't have the purchasing power, but they have no more purchasing power than the West. All the fashion houses from Chanel to Gucci to Louis Vuitton, they have major part of their revenues coming from emerging markets. If you look at the 10 biggest shopping malls that has been built in the last 10 years, 9 are in emerging markets. And there are some floors of those malls, or even some malls in some countries, are reserved only for foreign brands. That means there is a lot of purchasing power. So I think they are on the right way to develop, because so I will go back to my 3 points: the leadership, the more aware, the more solid leadership, the transparency thanks to digitalization, and then the fighting of corruption, which has now everybody is very much aware of, and the public is very aware of, and they are forcing their governments to comply with those things. I think these are the things that make emerging markets much more significant.
Great, thank you, Pervez. Very insightful. We had a couple of questions come in while you were talking about the difference between frontier economies and emerging economies in this respect. Do they follow a similar pattern? I mean, any of you want to weigh in there?
Yeah, of course, when we put countries into emerging market category, we have in mind economic factors, economic transformation, modernization of infrastructure, market liberalization, and a rapid industrialization. But what we don't talk about is political developments, social developments as well. In fact, there are these of course go hand in hand. Again, if you don't mind, I will share one slide video that will speak to this point. While we study in business the surface here in the iceberg metaphors, what we see on the surface is market potential. When Western economies look at developing and emerging markets, they see rising middle class, they see a huge discretionary consumption, lots of disposable income that leads to this aspirational consumption. What we do not see below the surface is, of course, these underlying social, cultural, and anthropological developments in terms of values, change in values, expectations, attitudes. Attitudes towards, for example, being more vocal in the political process, or attitudes towards women joining the labor force, or attitudes towards green environment, like Leanne was talking about. So these are also taking place. So in terms of coming back to the question of frontier economies, we don't necessarily see all of these taking place at the same rate as the truly emerging markets. And what is typically lacking is political, either absence or presence of political modernization of the political system. To what extent you have, for example, a free press, free media, to what extent you have a transparent and responsive government versus having an autocratic system. So I think some of the frontier economies are hindered because of autocratic systems, perhaps, and also lack of reforms in the political arena. Sometimes wars and natural disasters also get in the way in terms of disruptions, but we don't necessarily see the political machine keeping intact with the economic transformation.
Great. Thank you, Tamer. Now, if we could switch gears a little bit and talk about the research topics for emerging markets. Pervez, you mentioned the impact of the rapid digitalization and the transparency that follows from it. That would be a great topic. Are there any other topics that come to mind that are of particular interest for the academic community to delve further into?
Yes, I think digitalization is a very good topic, and especially how it is transforming emerging markets. So that is a good topic to look at the impact of digitalization on achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, on achievement of or getting rid of corruption and these type of things. The other things, I mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals all the time, but I think that my research is often on these type of issues, that how looking at the externalities of multinational activities. Whatever multinational companies are doing in these emerging markets, what are the impact of those activities on the society, on poor people? Because multinationals are often blamed that they go to an emerging market and they serve only 10% of the elite population. They never even think about lower middle classes or poor people. But and sometimes they even force the local governments to divert resources toward those elite populations so that there is a good infrastructure for multinationals to distribute their products. But so it is high time to look at what multinationals are doing for the society in general, and what the multinationals are doing for lower disadvantaged communities, and what they are doing for alleviation of poverty and so forth. So I think these are the great topics we ought to be looking at, not just looking at how multinationals can be more powerful, how multinationals can beat local competition, how multinationals can kill each other. So that's my take on it.
In that sense, Pervez, do you see a change in how Western multinational behave as opposed to emerging market multinational, and how they interact with the communities?
I think it is improving a lot. It is improving a lot, dependent on because multinationals have also realized that they are interdependent with the emerging market firms, because they cannot do everything most efficiently themselves. So now they are collaborating with more and more companies from emerging market, because emerging market companies have different type of capabilities than multinationals from the West have. And the multinationals from the West do need those capabilities. So that's why I think now it is, but it is again to the bigger companies in emerging markets, no? Not to the smaller or medium-sized companies, but the bigger companies of emerging markets, they are now collaborating with the Western multinationals quite a lot. So I think there is some dialogue and interaction going on, but it should go a bit lower down. That's right. My view.
Thank you, Pervez. Leanne, I know you've done some really interesting research around culturally specific factors in the growth of emerging markets specifically. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Just one topic before I defer to Tamir's slide about the list of research questions. I'm personally interested in the convergence and divergence of values, and how values like universal values like benevolence might help in the internationalization process of emerging market firms, and what need to be localized, individualized. So that's one topic I'm interested, but I will defer to Tamir's slide on the topics.
With that, I can respond to as well. I picked this background behind me for another reason. These mega projects, building highways and bridges and new campuses and hospital complexes, a lot of them are going on in the world of emerging markets. Of course, really some mega projects like the Chinese expansion throughout Central Asia. The way these are done are through what we call build, own, or operate and transfer, BOT projects. So the way these consortia, these construction companies bid for these huge projects, typically billions of dollars, and take place over many, many years, and involve so many firms in construction, engineering, design world for so many years, are typically the BOT projects, where the consortium, construction consortium comes, competes, gets the bid, puts together a team of participating engineering companies, design, architectural firms, and work on the production of this facility. They own the facility. This bridge, for example, behind me in Istanbul, will be owned by the consortium that built it for a period of 30 years before they transfer it to the sponsor, which is the government, the Turkish government. In the process, they get the return on investment by operating it over 30 years. And by the way, the Turkish government owes, and if the traffic over the bridge does not meet the necessary numbers in the contract, the Turkish government is liable to make up the difference. Anyway, we have seen really amazing number of amazing growth in research. Let me just show one slide here, which shows the amount of activity here on emerging markets. I just want to show you this particular slide, that over the past 30 years or so, the number of publications on emerging markets have just grown exponentially. This is just about half a dozen journals in international business. If you build up the scope a little bit, you'll find that there's many more. And the credit for putting together this data, by the way, goes to Maria Luisa. But what are the topics? Lots of topics, but what we can say is that research on emerging market has certainly revitalized scholarly activity and brought together also a lot of applied research, not just scholarly, but applied research as well. The literature has grown. There's a lot more comparative research. You mentioned, several of you mentioned about digital economy. For example, the comparison of, let's say, the Chinese portal, Alibaba, versus its counterparts in other parts of the world. So lots of new research, as well as new constructs, new frameworks in terms of institutional void, liability of foreigners, home country advantages, and so on. So when we look at some specific topics, we see that there are many. We can certainly look at these non-economic facets of the emerging market transformation, like we talked about, cultural, sociological. The rivalry between emerging market multinationals and advanced multinationals is of interest, and a number of our colleagues are doing research on that. For example, in this slide here, we see that when we look at, in particular, the Western firms going into various markets and establishing market shares, this is and over a period of 10 years. When we look at the Western multinationals' growth in market share in various markets over 10 years, on the horizontal column for this particular industry, we can do this for various industries, but this is the fruit and vegetable juice category. We see that Western firms have been successful in countries like China, Taiwan, Peru, and so on, but the local companies have beat them, have grown their market share. If you look at the vertical column here, much better than their Western counterparts. Basically, what we see here is that when Western multinationals go into emerging markets, they don't necessarily succeed in terms of gaining market share. There's a lot of rivalry. There's a lot of homegrown advantages that the emerging market multinationals benefit from. In fact, we have several papers coming out on this topic. Mega projects that I mentioned. Also, social accountability, sustainability, the importance of looking at not just national level marketing, but urban or city-based marketing, because this is what we've seen in much of the larger emerging markets like Indonesia, Brazil, China, and so on. There's a lot of diversity from region to region between, let's say, tier 1 cities and tier 3 cities. So looking at the focused way, granular way, the potential of market potential in these countries. Consumer behavior itself is a big issue. Entrepreneurship, we mentioned, and digital startups, rise of middle class definitely is a huge issue, and many questions underlying that particular topic. Why do we see, for example, a differential pace of middle class growth in certain countries and certain regions? Middle class values, attitudes that Leanne talked about. How do middle class consumers identify them and define themselves? And the differences between traditional versus new middle class, because the middle class that came into the scene, they're the ones that came into the scene last 3 decades or so. There was a middle class before then as well. So there is a tension between these two groups, and their profile also are very, very different. So there are lots of issues. Just to wrap up, one more slide here. Other important research topics, family business, state-owned enterprises, born digital startups, entrepreneurial ecosystem, relational versus contractual exchange, and so on. So
Right.
I think the topic is very, very timely.
Excellent. Thank you, Tommy. I think it shows there's no shortage of topics to be explored. And now I'm conscious of the time, and we have about 10 minutes left. So I think there's been a lot of questions coming in, and apologies in advance for those of you that we can't address this question in the next 10 minutes. But there seemed to be a lot of interest in finding out sort of what's happening. Now we got COVID-19. What's going to happen, do you think, in your perspective, to emerging markets in the next 10 years as we hopefully exit this global pandemic fairly soon? How do you see emerging markets in the next 10 years? And maybe, Leanne, we could start this question off with your perspective.
The Chinese word for crisis is both crisis, danger, and opportunities. So certainly the crisis have exacerbated the gap between rich and poor, and between knowledge workers and the low-skill workers. But at the same time, agile and innovative firms thrive in this pandemic, in the new norm, and accelerated technology innovation. So I think this is an opportunity for both practice and research, as well as intercultural collaborations on various issues, like climate, environmental issues, like the development of vaccines, and lots of opportunities there.
So in some ways, you're thinking the resilience of emerging markets will set them well for the decade ahead. What about the regional disparities? We know that some countries in Asia are forecast to do well. What about countries in Africa, for instance?
That's a good question. I don't have an answer right now, because the pandemic certainly hindered developed markets or international NGOs' efforts for help, for aid in Africa. So that's a serious challenge. But at the same time, I think there are potential innovations in that area as well.
Great, thank you, Leah. And Pervez, do you want to weigh in on the same question?
Yeah, I think coming back to COVID-19. So, in fact, the emerging markets have sort of handled that better than the Western markets, because I see many of the countries, not only China, China is almost back to normal, but even other countries like big countries, Indonesia, Pakistan, Turkey, they are not as badly affected as Western markets, and they are already on the plus side of the GDP development. So that is one thing. We early on mentioned resilience. Resilience is much stronger in these markets because because they are used to crisis handling, they are used to crisis management and these type of things. So I think there is a lot of optimism even out of this crisis, and companies are managing quite well. And then there is, of course, due to several issues with the West in the last few years, trade wars and this and that, there have been increased movements of intra-regional trade. So that means the trade among developing countries, the slides that Samir showed also, the trade among the countries, the emerging markets, is increasing enormously. Samir's slide also had the sentence on Belt and Road Initiative. This is amazing. 69 countries are involved, and they are all being connected. It's a multi-trillion-dollar project, and more than 1 trillion has already been spent. I come from Pakistan originally. Pakistan has 156 billion budget for that, just for that project, Belt and Road, to connect north to the south and then to the port. And 70 billion has already been spent. So that's enormous development happening, enormous development. Normally, I used to go every year to Pakistan, but then this time I went after 5 years, and I am shocked. I really cannot recognize. So much progress is going on, and so much development is going on. So I think these countries are coming to get out not as bad as the West, as far as COVID is concerned.
One final question for you, Pervez, before we turn it over to Tamer for a final word. You mentioned earlier that 30% of the world's Fortune 500 companies now come from emerging markets. Do you think within 10 years that will be more than 50%?
Oh, within 5 years.
Within 5 years. Wow.
I can bet within 5 years.
That's a prediction. Tamer, do you agree?
Yes, of course, it's hard to, generalize and say that they will all master this biggest disruption that we've seen in our lifetimes at the same level, same success rate, but we'll see great diversity among them. I think one of the defining factors will be how well they embrace technology, how well they have introduced new technologies, the contemporary ones, machine learning, AI, and all that. As well as I think how well they use their young populations, because one facet of these emerging markets, they have a large number of young folks between the ages of 15 and 35. So how well they're educated, to what extent they contribute to the entrepreneurial activity in their respective countries will be interesting. As well, some of these emerging markets have a larger proportion of seniors as well. So that will be a growing market, because their needs are different, and both local indigenous firms and Western firms are beginning to cater to them. So that will be a major factor but what we will see, I think, in general, higher rates of growth in GDP in emerging markets than in West economies, which will have to contend with 2%, 3% growth rate on an annual basis.
Great. So a very, very positive outlook for emerging markets. And again, I want to thank all the panelists for joining us today and for your great insights. And thank you, everybody, all the participants from around the world who've joined us. It's been a very informative session. Please feel free to follow up. And apologies to those whose questions we did not get to address for a lack of time.